Друзья, здравствуйте. Я человек с пингвином, меня зовут Антон Белов, я директор Центра современной культуры «Гараж», и я рад вас приветствовать на уникальном событии для «Гаража». Мы сидим в полном музейном с климатом здании, и будет сегодня проходить у нас первая международная конференция, что большое событие для «Гаража», и посвящена она такой большой проблеме, как этика, ну и вдвойне, наверное, интересна для России, потому что это этика перформанса. Вот, мне написали большую подсказку, кому я должен поблагодарить по поводу этого всего. Но сначала хотел бы сказать, что у вас на стульях лежат программки конференции. Обратите внимание, что завтра и послезавтра будет целый день происходить большое количество различных мероприятий, дискуссий, столов и презентаций. Завтра вечером также будут здесь происходить в той части за этой прекрасной парадной красной зоной живые перформансы. А в субботу вечером живые перформансы будут происходить не здесь, а в еврейском музее и Центре толерантности, который является партнером этой конференции. А все дискуссии будут происходить здесь. Кого благодарить обязательно нужно Министерство культуры, которое первый раз в этом году расщедрилось и поддержало негосударственные, некоммерческие организации, в том числе поддержало нашу конференцию, за что им огромное спасибо, и мы выносим свою благодарность. Также большое спасибо всем сотрудникам, которые трудились над этим безумием, стажерам, труд которых в гараже, наверное, неоценимый, их вклад всегда очень важен. Трам-трам-трам. Что для нас важно еще сказать, что сегодня вечером вы присутствуете, у нас будет презентация книги RoseLee Goldberg, мне даже сказали взять ее. Она вот такого милого розового цвета, мне кажется, подходит для женских сумочек. У нее очень красивый корешок, тоже будет блистать для вас. Кстати, RoseLee сказал, что эта книга, между прочим, переведена на 14 языков. Вот, и для нас большая честь, что она переведена на русский. Вышла она в рамках нашей совместной серии с издательством «Маргином». И это как бы наш такой завершающий проект на этот год. У нас всего сейчас вышло 6 книг. Но это Михаил, наверное, упомянет. Трам-трам-трам. В этой книге очень важно, что в отличие от всех остальных есть отдельная русская глава. И для нас это особая честь, что RoseLee включила русское искусство в книгу «История перформанса». Есть современная российская история перформанса. И мы надеемся, что эта книга будет иметь большой успех, и вам всем будет крайне интересно ее читать. Ну, кого поблагодарить? Обязательно Сашу Обухову сказали поблагодарить, потому что часть фотографий для этого раздела подобрала именно она. Ну и, наверное, мы попросим, хватит мне болтать, Михаила Гатомина, директора издательства «Маргином», который наш давний партнер, друг, и, собственно, большая часть усилий по изданию этой книги была на их стороне. Михаил.
Добрый вечер. Я тоже продолжу эту линию благодарности, потому что книга — это вопрос очень такой долгий и коллективный. Я хотел поблагодарить переводчицу Анну Асланян, редактора Сашу Извекова, который тут находится, и дизайнеров. И хотел просто сказать, что для нас, как для издателей, очень важно, чтобы книга не являлась таким мертвым куском бумаги, а была предметом обсуждения и дискуссии. Очень приятно, что вот вокруг этой книги удалось создать такую атмосферу. Есть живой автор, есть целая конференция, то есть с такой эгоистической издательской точки зрения это все, конечно, очень приятно. Очень советую действительно знакомиться с книгой. Впервые она вышла в 1979 году. Вот русский язык стал 15-м, для нас это первый опыт сотрудничества с легендарным издательством Thames & Hudson. И книга эта настолько классическая, что у британского издательства не было такой профессиональный издательский момент пленок. То есть эта книга еще из доцифровой эпохи, она каждый год 1979 года допечатывается. И я думаю, что русское издание, помимо дополнительной главы, приобретает еще особый смысл в связи с тем, что, конечно, последний год, последние 2 года мы видим расцвет акционизма и перформанса в наших краях, такого странного питерского, я бы даже сказал, направления. И книга в каком-то смысле начинается с русской темы, она начинается с футуристических кружков с бродячей собаки и кончается русским акционизмом. Конечно, это тоже очень интересно получить такой взгляд из-за рубежа. Ну и на самом деле, помимо этого, мы издали в этом году целых 16 книг, и очень приятно, что финальный аккорд удался. Так что общайтесь с автором, читайте книгу и удачи.
Спасибо, Михаил. Да, кстати, Михаил поскромничал, но забыл сказать, что мы издали уже 25 книг, и суммарный тираж их превысил 100 тысяч экземпляров. Некоторые книги уже 4 раза допечатались, правильно? Вот, чем мы несказанно гордимся и рады, что все их читают. А сейчас передаю слово, у нас будет маленькая дискуссия RoseLee Goldberg, автора книги, и вместо заявленной Юлии Аксеновой в программе у нас будет Анастасия Митюшина, не менее талантливый, еще более прекрасный человек, руководитель нашего образовательного направления, и передаю вам слово. Спасибо.
Спасибо. Добрый вечер, дорогие друзья. Остался один человек, кого мы не поблагодарили. Это Ольга Дубицкая, координатор издательской программы, без четкости и ответственности которой было бы невозможно выход ни одной книги издательства, нашей совместной программы с издательством «Avant-garde». И дальше маленький комментарий. Мы будем беседовать с RoseLee на английском, потому что у нас не так много времени, а дальше я удалюсь, и RoseLee будет читать свою собственную лекцию. Сейчас, now we're going to start speaking English, so I'm very happy to introduce you. And we're very happy that RoseLee is here. RoseLee is an art historian, critic and curator. And you can see now in Moscow one of her shows, which is called Performance Now. And it takes place in the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center. And it's open to everybody, and so we'll finish the conference there, as Anton said. And RoseLee is the author of the book, which was first published in 1979. It's called Performance Art from Futurism to the Present. And as Anton said, it's really that this book was published in 12 or even 14 languages already, so we now have 2 figures. And what I'm impressed, so that the book is, it's pioneered the research of the performance, and it's still so important that it keeps on producing. And I was impressed by the fact that RoseLee shared with me just recently that in China, this book even was published on like a pirate book without RoseLee name, and only in 1 month this book going to be published in China officially. So it even has like her own personal life. And also, what is important to say about RoseLee, so that RoseLee is the founder and director of the Performa, which is an amazing endeavor and undertaking, which was founded in 2004, and it is a non-commercial, non-profit organization which main activity is a Performa, which is a festival of performance, biennial, which goes regularly from 2005, and just 2 weeks it finished in New York with a performance to Performa 2013. And what is also important that this book is really a seminal book, and even 2010 it was RoseLee got also including for this book and year's Gand Prize from International Independent and International Curator Independence. I don't know why Kate is the head of this organization, and every time I try to pronounce it I got stuck with it. But now we get back to the book, and thank you for being with us. And my first question is that this book appeared in 1979. And in the introduction to it, you mentioned the fact that at that time, performance art was a kind of neglected, and so and you even found the reason for it, because it was so difficult to place it within the history of art. So my first question is very personal. Why did you personally choose to work with performance? Where is the reason of this interest?
I was a tap dancer. It's true. So I was a tap dancer and also studied art history. And growing up in South Africa, I throw that in there with a tribute, of course, to Nelson Mandela today. I was always interested in looking across at all disciplines. I don't think I would have dared to choose one single discipline. And for me, the history of culture, of life, is really looking across at politics, at economics, at architecture, at dance, at film, Really going back and forth, nowadays like a scanner, just constantly going across back and forth to different disciplines. And so that was my question: what do I do? How do I choose one of these areas? And that was started way back, a long time ago.
And also what I know already, so when you were studying this book, you were living in London. So there was a special context, so it's not New York, and so it's maybe at that time it was a more conservative thing. In the dedication of this book, you mentioned one person who really got interested with him. His name is Nikos Stangos, and it's a Greek poet, and he was rather famous in Greece. And this is an amazing person who got a residency in Great Britain because he was leftist and he didn't want to stay in the country of his own, who was changing. And he was a unique person because he was a poet, and on the other hand, he was a great publisher who had a sniff for the best books. And so you mentioned him as the person who really invited you to start on doing this book. Could you please tell us more the story of it, like prehistory?
I think I'm detecting a pattern here. The Museum of Tolerance, very interesting, a place for performance, and a radical editor, no question. And growing up in South Africa. So let's put those three things. I actually, and you're right, I was in London in a very conservative time, early 1970s. The Brits were really called Philistines when it came to contemporary art. They had a hard time with it. And I did my dissertation on Oscar Schlemmer and performance at the Bauhaus. So really started way back. I was very interested, again, as I said before, in this idea of working across two disciplines, in this case with Schlemmer. Do you all know Oscar Schlemmer's work? Just put your hands up so I can see, please. Yes? Okay, so some art historians. So as you know from Schlemmer, he was at the Bauhaus. It's the only art school ever to have a theater as a beating heart, right at the center of the school. So that was very interesting for me. And then what happened after that? Then I got a job at the Royal College of Art as director of the gallery right after school. And in those days, they didn't have curatorial schools. In fact, don't worry, you don't have to go to curatorial. Sorry, okay, I shouldn't say that. Anyway, our generation did not go to curatorial schools. We studied art history, which was pretty good background. And so when I got that job, I actually didn't know if you paid the artist or they paid you. I wasn't sure, but I just pretended that I knew what I was doing. And then I came to New York right away after getting the job, and I thought, this is good, I'm going to pretend like I know what I'm doing. So the first thing I did was I went to Max's Kansas City. Do you all know Max's Kansas City? Yes, please? Okay, sort of. And so coming back and forth, New York, seeing actually a lot of performance in New York. And then somewhere in between they met Nikos, and I was telling him what I was writing about. Because I was writing about the feminists and different actions I was seeing in New York and writing for London. And one of those perfect editors that one always hopes to meet in life, where we talked about this idea, and he said, great, when can you give me the book?
So how many years did it take you to make it?
I think it was actually just a year, because, that's what I focused on. It was fast. I had been working on a lot of that material over the time, so by the time I met him, I had been looking at a lot of material back and forth.
But so you made it so fast, and it was released in 1979. So since it was published in so many languages, and I think there were like 4 editions of it. So as Anton said as well, so there was like a small edition about the Russian current art scenes of the early 2000s, but also which changes, like before in all those 3 editions you made? Like, what was the key changes?
Actually, I don't change anything. I decided that if I did, I would never stop, So all I do, it's been in print continuously since 1979. It's never been out of print. I just open the back and I add on. And sometimes I'm a little surprised myself, like just 2 days ago before I got on the plane to come to Moscow, I opened the book and I thought, let me look, what did I write about Russia in 1979? And I was a little nervous. I thought, oh, wonder what I got right. And you know what? I was very excited. I thought, this stuff is amazing. This material is absolutely incredible. And so yes, you should know that the Russian chapter, which is the second chapter in the book, was written in 1978. That is not new. That's what I knew in 1978, coming out of school. And then the update contains a small section on the update of, and again, it's a very small section of what's been happening here in Russia in the last 10, 15 years. But that early material was written in 1978. And you can all tell me if I made any mistakes, but it's pretty good. Thank you.
Okay, so I have the time only for the last question, and then I'll leave the stage. And I think what is interesting to me always is that you say it's a separate project, it's a book, but also you're doing this enormous, huge Performa. So did you ever have any wish, like, to put something from Performa into the book, something very special, which you think is like really necessary to be here, from the very recent Performa maybe?
Yeah, it's in here. Actually, thank you for bringing up Nikos at the beginning, because I'll tell you a little story. I don't talk very often about it, but when I did Performa, Nikos was always nagging me just at the right time. Like, RoseLee, it's time for another book. You have to do another book. And I said, oh, can't I just do a book like a biennial, like a biennale? Maybe every 2 years I'll do a new book, and then I won't feel like I have to take you through the entire history of the world first. And he said, don't be ridiculous. You can't do a book like a biennial, because no one's going to buy a book that's a biennial. And so I literally said, okay, then I'll do a biennale. And that was kind of the story. And now indeed we do a book every 2 years. Sadly, Nikos died before the very first performance, so hi there Nikos, in Moscow, somewhere wherever you are. We do indeed have this biennial, and we do indeed do a book every 2 years. Again, just looking at the Russian chapter 2 days ago, I was just thinking, this is why I did Performa. People say, why did you start Performa? And I read this material and I look back on the history of the last 100 years of art. I think these people were fantastic. I mean, everything that was being thought about, the relationship between poetry and writing and what was going on with the eye and the film and the photograph and dance and manifestos and so on. This is really what inspired me to create Performa. And so I really go back and forth. The book inspires me to create Performa, and Performa is a way for me to insist that to understand new directions, which then actually does go back in the next book.
So then we very logically come to the place where you give us some prehistories, like getting us a little bit back. And when I ask RoseLee, how far shall we go? Will we manage to go from the very beginning up to the Performa? RoseLee said to me that it depends on the pace. So let's hope you have a pace so that we come to today's time, or whether you open up to us something very special from the past. Thank you so much. So now I'm leaving. So it's your turn.
Thank you. Okay, you can hear my voice then. Again, thank you everybody, and thank you Garage and Anton and Kate and Michael, and especially Dasha, who's not here, but I was here in 2010, so I'm beginning to feel like performance, this is really the home of performance in Moscow, because I brought a show then called 100 Years of Performance Art. Some of you might have seen it at the other garage. Did any of you see that earlier show? No? Yes? No? Okay. Yes, Anton saw it. Great. And actually today, earlier, a young woman was interviewing me and she said, isn't it strange you're coming to talk about performance in Moscow? No one's going to know what you're talking about. I said, no, actually I feel like I'm coming back to a place where performance was so strong in the early 1900s when this country was at such an exciting moment politically, culturally, the kinds of extraordinary exchanges going on, that I feel that this again is a rediscovery for everybody. And it's really only going to grow. I think this very exciting time in Russia, in Moscow. I haven't been to St. Petersburg yet, but I know from the history that there was always an amazing performance, that was an extraordinary performance venue. So I am going to go as fast as I can, but not too fast, so the translator can keep up with me. To really give you a general idea about performance. I think it's so exciting to recognize how vast performance is. Again, people are often saying to me, but isn't it just provocative and isn't it just painful and aren't people chewing glass and things like that? And it's very interesting that I think most people's idea of performance is really stuck in the 1970s. They see a certain kind of performance that was always about protest, that was always very difficult, durational, maybe even painful, people cutting themselves and doing dangerous things. But actually, that decade was very much about Vietnam, it was very much about the politics of youth culture, protest, 68 in Paris. There were a lot of reasons, civil rights, early feminism, or 70s version of feminism. There were a lot of reasons for very direct protest, and everybody was protesting. So it wasn't just the artists who were protesting. So yes, 70s performance is very protest-oriented, is very provocative, is often very annoying and unnerving. But this history that I wanted to show you today is really to show you a much greater variety. Okay, this slide here is just to remember that if you want to be an artist, you should always be well-dressed. It's very helpful. And again, the point we're going to talk about here, especially with these 5 men, there were a few women in the Futurists, but not many, is the fact that the Futurists were really the first group of the 20th century, along with what was going on here in Russia, to talk about art, the artist always being somebody who was outside the studio, was outside the garret, and that really that the most exciting way to be an artist was to work with artists from different disciplines. And maybe that's the key to this entire history of performance. That we're looking at periods in time when filmmakers were working with fashion designers, we're working with writers, we're working with musicians, we're working with people across the board, architects and so on. And this is really the theme that I want to keep going back to, about performance, and actually about the 20th century. I think we've all been put in little boxes for way too long. When you study art history, you study these little sections, surrealism, Dadaism, Futurism, and so on. And it's actually not true. It's not the way life works. Anybody who lives with an artist, right? Some of you live with artists. You know that this is just simply not true. It's not the way life works. People are, in one bed or the other, or moving around. Very often people are having big arguments. That's the kind of where really exciting ideas come from in the art world. So, I'm told to wait. Okay. So, also another interesting point about Marinetti, the Futurist, who was the guy in the middle, the best dressed guy. It helps also to be independently wealthy, which he was, so that also made it easy for him to travel around Europe at the time. But he also was very clever enough to have friends in high places. And in this case, very washed out slide, he did actually publish the Futurist manifesto on the front page of Le Figaro, which was the main newspaper in Paris. And again, in that newspaper, he said, this manifesto that was written with a group of young futurists, they said, we want to write about the new, we want to talk about the new century. And that new century actually in many ways is a bit like our new century. It was very much about speed, it was about aeroplanes and very different ways of thinking about the world, in the way that we're actually up against a world now that's accelerated in terms of speed. They also literally took their manifestos and used it to break down every single discipline. Anybody into garage music here? Yes? No? Your 12-year-old brother is, I bet you. Okay, thank you. Somebody's into garage music. So the Futurists built these noise machines. And so again, the idea, even with the early Futurist manifesto on sound, there was a Futurist manifesto on noise. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with artists like Lou Reed, who created entire albums, or Mike Kelly, creating entire albums about noise music. This was really the very beginning of noise music, with these extraordinary machines that were built by the Futurists in 1913. Mechanical age, the whole idea of the machine, the idea that you won't need people anymore. Very much, again, the kinds of things we talk about now. Robots, are we going to be necessary? How are we going to live in this world where it's so digitalized? So there again, many of the ideas that were translated from the artists into performances, into actions, into making paintings and so on. And what I want to really take you through a few side references here as we move into the Russian material at the same period. This is all, we're talking from 1900 to 1912, 1913. Was again this idea of the artist as an activist, the artist, and I'm talking about here visual artists. I don't use the word performance art, by the way, you might notice that. I think I'm talking about, these are artists who also make performances. It's always been work that comes out of the art world, and artists then also are very busy as making performances. So of course, Mayakovsky, David Berliet, using language, using painting their faces, using the idea of the artist as activists. Something we'll be talking about tomorrow too is the idea of an artist as having an ethics. The artist is having a sense of morality. And in this case, I think we mean morality as it relates to the kind of art that they were making. So early, really 1913, there's this famous, wonderful play that was put together by Mitsushin, who was a musician, by Malevich, who was making the costumes, and by Kelnikov, who's the writer. And what they were doing is actually creating this live performance using the ideas from their artwork. And again, for this thing's moving by itself. Okay. So what I'm really trying to take you through again is this idea of the involvement of the artist in politics, in the actions, the activism of the city. Maybe the early 1900s in this country was the only time artists were really employed. They were employed by the state. They had jobs. They could actually be part of getting the new economic policies out to the country. And as you know very well, at that point in the early 1900s, there was a hugely illiterate population in this country. And then by the time of the revolution, Lenin and the entire conversation about the new economic policy was not really understood, and there were people who simply couldn't read the newspapers even. So artists were employed to go around the country, whether it was a Blue Blouse group or the Living newspaper, to explain the new society that was coming along, and at that moment in time, a very thrilling new society that everybody was hoping was going to change the country in very positive ways. So again, this idea of the artist being very involved in society, in the culture, actively getting out on the street. In this case, it was, probably you all know about this anyway, but I'm just reminding you, it's your own history. But really, looking at this 1920, which was reconstructing the storming of the Winter Palace. And this, of course, was designed by artists at the time. And this was actually a map made of the palace. They involved over 30,000 members of the army. They had the Red Army, the White Army. This entire event was reconstructed, obviously in a very theatrical way, but again, using the art community, using the artists as a way to move around the country, to really animate politics. Also a very interesting moment in time when the politics was such a utopian vision of the world. There was so much excitement about this vision for a brief period anyway. And the sense that the artists could be actually active, useful, part of a society in a very profound way. And what was also intriguing was that they did it at such an avant-garde level that you could use the most radical artists to get together to come and make these new plays. Meyerhold, of course, with his theater and this famous piece, Magnificent Kuckuck, again creating a theater that he could move around the country, because that was, again, another one of the criteria, that to be an artist, to participate in this new culture, the whole idea was to be able to move ideas around this vast country. And so the stage was built in such a way that it could fold up and almost not quite be put in a suitcase, but it really could be moved around. And my whole, there's wonderful writing by him, I'm sure a lot of you have read it, I've only read it in translation, talks again about the artist, how he wanted to work with certain artists, how he then found the Russian constructivists, and literally pulled them in together and said, how do we make this theater that looks so different, that looks so new, that carries new messages into this new country, this new world that we're looking at. Costumes, of course, by the artists, by Popova, Ludmila Popova, who was involved with creating the costumes for Magnificent Popov. Even finding entirely new ways of moving. I'm sure, again, probably all of you know about biomechanics developed by Meyerhold. But the idea there being about how do we create a new way of communicating, use the body, not necessarily language, how do we reach a large population, how do we get as far as possible across the country to get these really exciting ideas across. So Blue Blouse Group, some of you are aware of that too, which was another way. This was started in 1923. There were 50,000 members of the Blue Blouse Group across the country. People could join up to be part of this activism, a way again of communicating the new culture to a large part of the population. They'd get on trains. You've seen images of agit trains, agit prop boats, really taking stories about the new culture around the country. And so just again showing you some of your own history that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with, but just again why I tie this all together and why I call this, I've never, it's part of what I call performance. I'm probably the last person to limit performance art to any one idea, accepting that very often the context in which this takes place and that the most radical ideas invariably come out of the art world. And that's where, again, the artists are pulled in to deal with new ways, to find new aesthetic approaches to whether it's theater or architecture or design, or in this case, in film. So again, we're looking at a very, very rich period, including this amazing period in 1930 when Mayakovsky does a work called Moscow's Burning, which took place in a circus. So the level of imagination, the crisscrossing into high art and mass culture, these are all things that we're still looking at and still trying to understand. A beautiful set by Einstein, also moving between film and artists. And so that was just my little detour there to tell you something of your own history, to remind you where this fits in. Then we move across to Paris. And of course it's 1924, we're really still in this early 20s period, and looking at this wonderful set by Picabia that was made with very big bright lights which would really blind you when you were sitting there. People were actually given sunglasses to sit in the audience. And again, a collaboration, extraordinary collaboration with Eric Satie. Man Ray was in this project. Duchamp was there, very much something that, again, the art world was completely cross-pollinating their own creative ideas. And a brief note here about Schlemmer, as I mentioned before, Oskar Schlemmer, working again in dance and as a painter. And the wonderful way he described his conflict was, he said, one side of him was Apollo, that was his intellectual side, and Dionysus, of course, is the dancer in him. And he really created an entire teaching workshop in the school at the Bauhaus to utilize both these sides of his brain, both these sides of his passions, really. And again, came up with the most extraordinary results by really merging this idea of the dancer and the visual artist. He was also a sculptor, of course. He worked in metal. This is part of something called the metal party, a metal dance. And then this was also translated into something called the metal party. So this very integrated relationship, which is, I think, another reason I keep wanting to stop and explain some of the reasons I started Performa. But there really was the sense for me that going to New York in the 70s of this extraordinary community. We'd be up all night and all day talking and arguing about where we were heading and what art was about and what can it possibly mean. And this was another reason for me, studying something like the Bauhaus, realizing that everybody's living in this little town in Weimar, and everybody's, again, part of creating parties as well as creating theater works, as well as creating, moving around the country, having people like Kurt Schwitters come and visit and so on. So that was another reason for me to say, I want that again. I think we need that kind of community in New York. A wonderful piece by Schlemmer, which is made of glass, a glass costume. And here is a piece, it's called the Slap Dance, where you can again see the artist drawing and the exact way that he's breaking up space. So he's both using performance to teach drawing, to teach what it means to be inside a space, and also to create figures in space, to create performance. So I think you're starting to get the idea of what I'm trying to lead you to, that performance is not one single thing. It's always been part of the life of the artist. It can go way back. We can go back to Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci did live performances. When Cosimo de' Medici's daughter got married, guess who he invited to come and organize the wedding? It was actually Leonardo who organized this incredible event for the wedding. The beautiful drawings of the staircase in the palace where Leonardo created these different events. So again, my starting point is the history of art, certainly the last 100 years and even way back before then. Artists have always been involved in creating live performance. But what did happen is that people have never understood where to place this material, how to put it into the history of art as we know it. So this is really, again, my introduction to you today is to say, look at this extraordinary variety. It's not limited to a notion of being provocative or being dangerous or being disturbing, although that is what a lot of it was about in the 70s. So jumping ahead several decades and into this, looking at people like Yves Klein, this is another question that's coming up a lot these days, and I don't know if it's come across your questions as art followers. I'm getting asked this question about buying performance. Have you been following this one lately? Can you buy performance? Can it be bought and sold? We'll get into that later, but the point being, I also wrote a piece for actually the art newspaper recently that said, most museums actually already have performance art departments. They just don't know it. They don't realize that the paintings of Yves Klein were made during performance, or a video by Joan Jonas was made as part of a performance. So in fact, again, this kind of idea of art has been there all along. I thought it's good to remind you about audiences, and just so that you realize who's out there. And I think audience is something we think about a lot also with Performa. It's something I'm really questioning because, of course, I'm the first in line to be the audience, and I really want that experience. Just as I have it as a critic, I want that experience when I go and see performance, and I'm very demanding in many ways. And of course Manzoni, again, if we're thinking now, starting to move through this history of 20th century art into a more conceptual vein, looking at somebody like Manzoni, who's again looking at the live body with a lot of irony as being the artwork. This level of things we've called body art, I'm sure you're familiar with Gilbert and George. So we're really looking again at this huge variety of what we're calling performance. The little lady in black, anyone want to guess who that is? It's Cindy Sherman. And that's actually a good exercise. I was once asked to come to my daughter's school when she was very little, and they said, can you come and explain what you do and so on. So I decided that all 10-year-old girls were busy doing dress up. So I did a whole lecture for them on Cindy Sherman's, the best lecture I ever gave. It was so clear, they got it, completely understood it. So yes, indeed, Cindy, in the old days, I remember being at a party in the late 70s in New York and seeing this strange little old lady walk into the party, and everyone else was wearing skinny black jeans, and it's like, who invited her? Who is that? It's like, oh my God, it's Cindy. And so Cindy would show up at events and parties and dressed up. So again, I think there's so much of performance in the history of 20th century art as we know it, but it will always be ignored because somehow it's just been left out of the conversation, and it's too difficult to understand where to put this material. So of course some of Cindy's early work, her first historical photographs when she went to live in Rome for a year. And then I'm really jumping ahead to tell you a little bit why I started Performa and how I came to commission work. This is the work I'm sure some of you recognize of Shirin Neshat, a beautiful Iranian artist. And I was feeling by the end of the 90s that so much of the work we were looking at, whether it was people like Shirin, like Cindy, Gillian Waring, Steve McQueen, Douglas Gordon, so many artists were actually doing these amazing film installations, and so much of that work was so pristine and so beautiful. And again, having to do with the new technology and the abilities, what was going on with film and the scale at which you could project. And I remember sitting in Venice watching this piece of Shirin's, and one of the biggest spaces out there that they'd recently taken over. And I was almost in tears. The work was so beautiful. It was this man singing in a public venue, the woman singing alone, because in Iranian culture she's not allowed to sing in front of an audience. There was sound, there was music, there were these two giant screens. And I remember sitting there thinking, why doesn't performance feel like this? You know, why am I still seeing things where people are cutting themselves and dripping blood and, you know, doing all these very strange things? And I just felt I needed to see something else. I wanted to see what would happen if somebody as accomplished as a visual artist at making such blatantly seductive and beautiful work, but also politically and intellectually very profound and very demanding and complicated. What would happen if somebody like Shirin did a live performance? And that's really the starting point, plain and simple. So I came back to New York and I went to see Shirin and I said, would you ever think of doing a live performance? Because you have all the ingredients. You have this storytelling, you have men and women, East and West, black and white, Christianity and all the other religions, Judaism and so on. You have this amazing sense of time, there's emotion. Would you think of doing a live performance? And she said, great, I'd love to, what a great idea. And that's really how the commissioning idea started. And so the two of us, I don't know, I'd never raised money before, I didn't know what to do, but I pretended again that I would figure it out. And we got a residency up at a place outside of New York at Massimo, and we went up there, and this was actually, sorry the slide is so washed out, but this is actually filmed inside a limestone quarry that is that color. It's the limestone makes the water absolutely turquoise. And the singer Susandein was in a chador, and she climbed into the water, and that's really where this whole production began. And for me, what I asked Shirin if she could possibly think of doing, which was walk everybody off the wall, off the screen, into the space. That's what she did, and really it was like a dream come true. And there I was, we literally went out and painted the mountain red, we made a big mess. I nearly got sued by the motel for messing up the carpet. So I don't know if you, now you are going to have to take the lights down. But anyway, you're not really able to see what's going on, but basically she delivered what I'd been dreaming of, which was this film triptych. It was a story based on an ancient Iranian 12th century poem. It had everything to do with politics and poetry. It was beautiful, and we produced it at the Lincoln Center. So that was the first project I'd ever produced. And that's again this idea of, okay, how do we keep going from here? How do I create this biennial? And that's when I came up with the idea of doing the biennial. So, tell you where we are in this piece. So opening night in 2005 was a very beautiful work by a young artist called Jesper Just, who had never done any live performance before. As with Shirin, he worked in film and video, although his video, he was also very inexperienced. He'd never done anything more than a 7-minute video before. And similarly, I said to him, would you ever consider doing something live? I want to commission you to do something. And he said, great, sure, what do you want? I said, I have no idea, I just want you to surprise us, you know, take us somewhere we've never been before. And again, this was opening night for Performa 05, and really said what I've been trying to say all along. I want to see if performance can go in an entirely new direction, maybe because we're supporting it, because I'm behind trying to do whatever we can to find the right kind of money, the right kind of environment, to really dedicate a biennial to this very unusual medium, this thing called performance art. Because really, I just felt I was tired of seeing it being a sideshow. I was tired of going to the Venice Biennial, and always at the end you get told, oh, you can go and see a performance tonight, but you got to walk down 5 different canals, and you're exhausted, and you've just been looking at art. And it was the last thing I wanted to do, and I thought, no, I want to dedicate a biennial just to this thing called live art. And we're going to use time very differently, and we're going to make you sit down and watch something rather than leave after 5 minutes. And so it's really taken on a whole life of its own, of the kind of work we produce. And back to your question about what has it changed in my book, it essentially has turned a lot of corners. I think it's shown people that performance can look very, very different. And because of that, we have a huge audience. We get over 40,000 people coming to see these projects that we do. We had over 4 million hits on our website last year, just during 3 weeks. So what that's telling me too is that by looking at performance in an entirely different way, people have been very, very excited about what it can look like, what it can talk to them about, and the artists have also always gone ahead and agreed to do something. So what you're looking at, you can bring the sound down a bit so I can talk over it. Everything is projected, only one figure there on your left and on your right. There's only one figure who's live, everything else is projected. And essentially what this first night of Performa said was, we're taking you down an entirely new path of our performance. You're going to see things you've just never seen before. So that was very, very exciting as a way to open it. Here's another scene from that production. I'm going to go quickly because I don't think you can see much of this, but this was another piece by Francis Elise where we worked with a stripper. Again, because we don't have a space, we use the city, so it's very much about a form of radical urbanism, and certainly in New York it was something I felt we needed to do. It's a terrific piece where they're dealing with high and low. The two at the back are singing Schubert Lieder, and the front is a real stripper. And I know because my son had to research it for me, and he had to photograph strippers when they came to the house and send them to Francis Elise through a special secret channel on the internet until we found the right stripper. This next piece is by this is a work by Laurie Simmons. Some of you art historians know her photographs, which she brought to life by thinking up an entirely new wonderful performance. So I'm just taking you really very quickly from now on. I'll stop and give you a few clues, but this was a work from 05, also with Marina Abramovich, doing 7 easy pieces that she did at the Guggenheim, and really introducing very strongly this idea of reconstructing earlier performances. So now that this history is finally being acknowledged, there's of course this question about, can we re-perform performances? What happens if you redo a performance? Obviously the artist, in fact Marina was herself one of the people who said, I will never do another performance of something I've done, it's just about me and it'll never be done by anyone else. But of course we all break our own rules, and she is now constantly doing her own performances, or actually training other people to redo their performances. So we're seeing a lot of different changes in this idea of what is artist performance. This is her doing a piece by Gina Pane. We also, in this entire festival, we really take people all over the city. It's just actually quite thrilling. I had this performance that's just finished. We had 14 curators and artists coming from Korea, and they said they just you know, they were so excited to come to New York, but they had no idea that they'd be going up and down to Brooklyn and downtown and uptown. And this was actually done in a private collector's home as well, which was open to the public. So this was also in '05 with an artist called Tammy Bentor. And '07 we brought in a lot of dance. So we had people like Isaac Julian working in that production. And this was, again, our very first big co-production. We co-produced with Sadler's Wells. So now we, as a matter of course, are always looking for partnerships, which has really been very, very important. So the next big project we do, you can be sure we'll be partnering with Garage and find something where, if you're going to go to all that trouble to create something, it's great to have it seen in more than one time just in New York. So this is more of the Isaac Julian piece. We do a lot of work outdoors, so there's work. This is a piece by Pablo Bronstein, an English artist, so a piece that he took these various dances through different city centers and different buildings. And these different events, again, would happen at all kinds of time of the day and night. This was a wonderful piece by Francesco Vizzoli, who famously said to me, "I'm only going to do one performance in my life, RoseLee, and it's for you." And after he did this, it's all he wants to do is more and more performance. So I think what also happens is that artists get very excited about discovering the layering, the different ways, the different messages that they can get across. And there's a lot of excitement about doing live performance. So this was actually done at the Guggenheim. It included famous actors and actresses, which is the way he likes to do things. So Kate Blanchett was in that. We had Anita Ekberg in it. There were a lot of, so you'll see a lot of different people, actors, and took place all over the Guggenheim. It was upstairs, it was downstairs in the theater. Really very, very clever, wonderful, totally imaginative use of the Guggenheim building. And it was actually based on a play of Pirandello. Any of you who know Pirandello's writing, always a big question mark. It was a play called You're Everything, I'm Right You Are, If You Think You Are. And a wonderful ending with Kate Blanchett taking the elevator in the Guggenheim, going to the top floor and then coming all the way down and basically uttering the last line of the Pirandello play. So again, we're looking at every single production coming at us from such a different place. This is a piece that is actually in the Jewish Museum. It's a work by a young artist called Kelly Nipper. And again, this was a whole series in '07 where we introduced dance. There was a very big dance section to Performa that year. And a lot of artists we were looking at were using choreographers as material rather than, not necessarily, she wasn't a choreographer herself, but rather using the work of others really as her material. And again, I'm almost reluctant to show you just these little bits, but rather in this instance to show you a range, that there is no such thing. When people say to me, what is the trend or what's going on, what you're seeing here is work that is as varied as the hundreds of artists that we're working with. And again, in a sense, because Performa is there, because we work very, very closely with the artists from beginning to end, there's a huge amount of courage and ambition that goes into the work. An artist like Adam Pendleton, he actually told me much later that he lied to me about his age. He was only 23. Wouldn't have made any difference. He told me he was 28, but it's okay. And he had an incredible musician, Jason Moran, working with him. Absolutely stunning piece. And again, it's really launched him. He's really turning into a wonderful, wonderful artist that everybody wants to have as part of their gallery. And he was completely unknown from when we took him on. But again, we're there for him completely. I said, be ambitious, we'll make your dreams come true. Just do whatever, let's take it the whole way. Okay. This was a very beautiful piece. Do you know Natalie Gerberg's work? Great. A wonderful piece, again, surprise, surprise, where she did this live element to the work. What she did with it was, she's actually doing the soundtrack live with her boyfriend, Hans Gerb. So all these little animals, very pedigree animals, bomb the hell out of each other. You see they've got little hand grenades. And then they will end up in the hospital. And again, the amazing thing about Natalie's work, I'm sure some of you have seen it in a museum or, you know, when you walk through, and like most stuff we see in museums, you spend about, I don't know, probably 2 minutes if you're lucky, you never really see the end. And the beauty of a lot of these works, which is why they're also sometimes the very best work that that artist has done, is, you know, we close the doors. We put you in a space, we find the most interesting space. This was actually done in a very strange little old theater, where all the seats were made from old car seats. And it was absolutely riveting. And so this whole story was two half-hour films, unbelievably imaginative, beyond all, with also this curious story in a sense, because it really looks like it could be in some Middle East sort of suicide bombing situation. And then the beauty is that she was doing the soundtrack live, so she was there with her boyfriend, and I don't know how to make this work.
而且你摇花切的时候呢，我觉得可以听歌啦，比较好了。阿妹即是扮假装，我记得把你发光。今天你要老实讲，我是可以做这些运动，然后你觉得很舒服。就好像很放松。 然后大自然这样子。
So these are 30 people on the rooftops of New York, work by Christian
这
Jankowski.
个意思就是说，就是爱自己，还有说可以，好像在这么冷的天气可以。
And actually what that came about, I mentioned that 07 was about dance, and Christian was wondering what he was possibly going to do about dance. And then I actually said to him, well, you know, Trisha Brown did this amazing dance piece on the rooftops of the city. So he said, I said, so why don't you do an homage to Trisha? So this really comes out of that particular piece. Okay, and again, I have just some different things from different performers. This was reconstructing Alan Kaprow, different pieces that we've done reconstructions of. This was our first food piece, which was on the 100th anniversary of the Futurist banquet. And this is a scene from the Futurist cookbook, which says green light on milk. And the entire evening was set up, really bringing art history to life. You know, how do we get people to eat history, to be part of that? And it was an amazing event where we had followed all the stories of Futurism. We had this amazing band, we had the Futurist noise machines. There's one thing about having special odors on your neck, so people were going around spraying people. Food was all part of the Futurist manifestos, so those were terrific. And of course the Futurist noise machines that year, we actually rebuilt them all, so all 13 of them have been rebuilt. And we've been touring this for about the last 5 years, no, 7 years. It's just opened actually at Red Cat in Los Angeles. It's always on the road. And we've been actually commissioned a lot of young composers to compose work for the noise machines, so that's been terrific. 09 again was the 100th anniversary of Futurism. This was a very famous dinner party that we did, and actually when I was in Moscow last time and I was on television, they knew all about this party, which I found really interesting. So, you know, when you go to a party you get nuts, so here were the nuts. Then you get drinks, so you had to help yourself to drinks. Then you went downstairs and there were spare ribs with honey pouring down from the ceiling. Then you had to find your knives and forks, which were all in the pots in the middle of the table. And dessert was Jeff Koons' bunny made out of chocolate. So all the poor collectors had to destroy these chocolate bunnies in order to eat the dessert. Dessert was also could be found, you had to put these gloves on and go digging inside these sugar vats. And this was alcohol, red, white, and water. So you're getting this is a beautiful piece we did actually in Times Square. Beautiful piece by Mike Kelly. Sadly, he did not stay around to do the second version, which was going to be actually an opera that we had ready to do at Brooklyn Academy of Music. A wonderful piece that he did. And that's actually Mike right in the corner there. You can see him there. And this was actually based on a film that he had made, which was based on American yearbooks, these yearbooks that they make in high school. And so it was a lot of layering, and again, the invitation to him was, can you bring your film to life that you had made of this particular work? So again, lots of layering, lots of ways of thinking in more complicated ways about the work, a lot of conversation, working with an artist for over a year and a half on developing these. Another work quickly I'll take you through, which is a work by Candace Brights, where she had 5 sets of identical twins in the play. This one was a little too conceptual. Nobody got it, that there were 5 sets of different people in the play. So they were all identical twins, and the first half took place and then the second half, and done with 2 different casts. And let's just see what else is next. I'm just going to race you through. This is the Performa hub that we always build because we really want everybody to come and hang out and spend a lot of time with us. We do that every year. We also took it to Santiago, Chile. We've traveled with it. We've taken it to Shanghai. Russian constructivism was the theme for Performa 11. We had Almgren and Dragset in that one. Mika Rottenberg. This was a terrific piece by a young artist, and again, just an example of an artist who's a painter. Her name is Iona Brown, and you can see her 2 obsessions in life are hip-hop and kabuki. And somebody introduced me to her and said she's always wanted to do a kabuki play, but using hip-hop themes. So we literally helped her build that, and she took, had these dances from the House of Ninja, which is this Vogue dance group that's been around in New York since the 90s. And really created an absolutely startling piece of work that came out of And how are we doing on time? I don't want to take you too far. We're okay? This is a magical work by an artist called Liz Magic Laser, I kid you not. A fantastic work which actually came out of Russian constructivist reader that we gave to her. So for each biennial, just so you know, we create these readers that I give to all the artists, all the curators that we're working with. And in this case, Liz Magic Laser had never heard about the living newspapers, and she read several articles about living newspapers and decided that actually in America, the living newspaper was the daily TV, these awful shows that you listen to. And she really did possibly the most brilliant piece I've ever seen, where she had 4 different sets of couples as though they were at a movie theater. So imagine that right sitting next to you is a couple who is actually an actor, and these cameras following them around. And the texts were all taken directly taken from the daily television. And this is Sarah Palin being interviewed by Glenn Beck. And you can see they're sitting amongst the audience.
Yeah, but you failed before.
Okay. This was a very beautiful piece we did with an artist called Haroon Mirza, which was actually as part of Times Square. And very interesting because you can never get Times Square. Amazing. Not for they have the 1 minute, New York minute. And we actually had it for 30 minutes, which was quite remarkable. It's the first time an artist has ever been able to do that for 30 minutes. Last year, again, a lot of new dance with an artist called Boris Shamatz. And this, I think I'll end here for you. It's a 12-hour Mozart, the last song of Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, and played from 12 noon to midnight. And this is a work by Ragnar Kjærsen. So what you're looking at here, this last song just played over and over again with a full orchestra. By the end, everybody was screaming and shouting and standing on their feet and just, cheering the musicians on. Amazingly, nobody collapsed. They all had voices at the end. Okay, I'm going to end with Russia. Back to the beginning. So this was also in the last biennial in 11, where Garage actually brought to town, to New York, this major exhibition, which came out of my first visit here in 2010, curated by one of your own curators, Yulia Askanova. And it was really to answer that question. I said, I really want to go back into this history of Russian performance and pull it out and find all these things that would be missing. And actually the exciting thing is that Yulia is now working on the long, large, fully rehearsed version of this exhibition that we started in New York. And we've got about another 200 performances to go. But what I really wanted to do was point out that you'll never again be able to say what is performance art with a straight face and is it provocative, or what are the other questions, mainly because what I wanted you to see in this instant is this extraordinary range, and the range is as varied and as brilliantly imaginative as every artist you'll ever meet. And so I leave you there with lots more to think about. Thank you very much.
Поднимайте руки, к вам придут наши прекрасные стажеры, чтобы вы могли задать вопрос.
Спасибо огромное за вашу лекцию. У меня вопрос в связи с тем, что вы сказали о том, что вы, что вы показываете на фестивале, оно призвано как бы расширить границы, что границы все шире и шире, и что нет практически ничего такого, чего вы не можете увидеть на территории перформанса. А проводите ли вы при этом границы все-таки между существующими видами искусства, которые все больше мигрируют на территорию друг друга, допустим, между перформансом и театром, перформансом и хореографией, да, потому что, например, там такие театральные режиссеры, как Ромео Костелуччи, они, хотя и много берут из перформанса, перформерами себя не считают, да, вот видите ли вы границы? И второй вопрос я хотел задать по поводу политической составляющей. Вы говорили про 70-е, где протестная составляющая была велика. А работаете ли вы, интересны ли вам какие-то новые вещи в активистском искусстве, которые в связи с последними протестными движениями по всему миру возникли? И как вы их оцениваете? И считаете ли вы интересным для себя как-то включать их, может быть, в какие-то ваши проекты?
Two questions that you asked. I'll try to get to both of them. Yes, I do think it's, I realize that I'm looking at the edge of the art world with so many different edges. It's the edge between art and the dance world. If you look at people like starting with, Yvonne Rainer, Trisha Brown, Simone Forti, Jerome Bell, Tino Segal. These are people who literally, have two legs, one each planted, very specifically in those different disciplines, and they follow it very closely. You're looking at the theater world. Yes, Robert Wilson, Richard Foreman, starting in the 60s, were straddling both those sides. They had one foot in the art world and one foot in the theatre world. Somebody like Karen Finley, or do you know Eric Bogosian's work? And I'm sure there are a lot of people here as well that we could be talking about. So in each case, I'm very close to looking at those differences. And actually one of the more easy definitions is the one between theatre and live art and artist performance. And it's interesting too, because at the moment the theatre people are coming more and more towards performance. Somebody like Matt Wellman in the States, they're stripping theatre down, you know, the way that, say, Yvonne Rainer stripped dance down. So it is about, I'm constantly looking at those edges. And as far as the politics, absolutely. I mean, we've certainly had, you know, different artists coming in from, you know, this year we actually had the Brax Media Collective, for example. This year we had a whole conversation about citizenship, and by that I meant this idea of, again, people coming from far away from the center place of the art market. So we're looking at a lot of different audiences, at those different edges where the art world touches those other kinds of worlds, which is, again, the way people live, the way artists live. So we're not doing anything that doesn't already exist. I mean, I've had Tanya Bruguera as part of Performa. We've had, I've always had that political component. And in fact, Isaac Julian and Shirin Neshat were very political. They just do it in such a delicious way that you don't realize you're being seduced. But there's always an enormous amount of politics in that work. So indeed, there is that. And I'm always looking for work that has a very strong content and strong, you know, a strong moral sort of weight to it, in a sense. So is that 2 questions? Yeah.
Вот вы сказали, что как это правильно сказать по-русски-то? В общем, не кажется ли вам, что вообще все перформансы, как и любые акты современного искусства, любой акционизм, они изначально были нелегальными. И, в принципе, вот, например, фестиваль перформанса или, ну, вообще какие-то легальные перформансы, это что-то сродни легальным митингам, оцепленными турникетами и полицией где-то далеко, где это никто не увидит, и не будет такого воздействия, если перформанс сам нелегальный. Ну, это как легальный граффити, как, не знаю, целоваться в противогазе. В общем, что это, ну, какое-то такое замкнутое в себе варево. Вот, это первый вопрос. Второй вопрос, как, например, простой, никому неизвестный парень вроде меня, который делает перформансы, может попасть на фестиваль перформа для того, чтобы там что-то сделать? Это второй вопрос. Зовут меня Донат Сгрудович. Спасибо.
Well, to answer your second question first, you've done very well. How do you do? I think your first question, it's an interesting question. What makes work radical? If I think of somebody like Yvonne Rainer, she's going to be 80 this year, painful as it is to say, and she's as radical as can ever be. Our ideas can remain radical. Maybe that also has to do with ethics and ethos and morality that we're going to talk about tomorrow. Again, the one thing I do want to get away from this idea that all performance is about the illegal. It's not. What's interesting is that you can do it differently. You don't have to be invited into a museum. You don't have to, you know, there are not as many gates along the way because it can be anything. And I will even go so far to say that because it's still largely non-commercial, it's not really, it can never really be co-opted. Yes, we do a biennial. Yes, I'm making choices. Yes, I've got 30 other curators making choices. But you know what? That happens in everything in life. You know, your 5-year-old child, the mother gives you $5, you have to make a choice. How are you going to spend the $5? And hopefully you still look for work that makes that particular choice really relevant or important. There's no way that you're going to be able to cover every possible, you know, touch every subject every time. Like somebody said, are you going to do politics? Yes, we've done politics. There's been a lot of politics. Might not be your politics. It might be Isaac Julian's politics. But he's talking about the African diaspora, and he's doing it with a very, very beautiful, fine hand. He's using gorgeous film to say this, but in his world, he's deeply politically involved as a human being, and he wants to use his art to be deeply political and involved and humanist. That might not be someone else who does a protest chaining themselves to a wall somewhere, you know, to a chain fence. So again, even our ideas of how we might articulate that political position, you know, going back to the Russian constructivists, they came up with a visual language that is so radical and so beautiful and was political. You can be all those things, and it's always going to be different. And so any of these questions you ask, I can come up with 10 different ideas. Walid Raid, you know, what is he making? Yes, it's political. Is it beautiful? Yes, it's also beautiful. He's found an aesthetic for his politics. Of course, another quote, and sometimes it says, Lenin, sometimes, you know, ethics is the aesthetics of the future. You could make a choice that's an aesthetic choice, and come up with something incredibly beautiful. It might not be, and it could still be illegal, you know, but it doesn't have to be. That's up to the artist's ability, how clever they are in a sense, to be able to understand all these things that we need to understand more and more these days. You know, if you're working in politics, if you're working in visual storytelling, if you're, you know, the guerrilla girls in New York, I mean, that to me was the problem with the Wall Street protests. You know, Wall Street, I just think that graphically it was horrible. So I don't take it seriously, because I shouldn't say that publicly, but you know what I mean. I just do feel that there's so many ways of being political, and you can still be radically political, and you can still do it in a very beautiful way, you can still do it with a powerful aesthetic, and you can do it without permission. You don't need somebody to invite you to be part of a biennial. I'm very aware of all of those things, I can assure you, but I also feel that as an organization, we're about as radical as you can be while having to deal with the reality of raising money and paying people and making sure that, you know, your young assistants have enough money to pay for their rent. These are realities too. So I can be as anarchic as I want, but I also have to deal with the reality of where I can find funds to pay a young artist to survive. So, but in my ethos, the way I look at it, I'm always looking for those questions. I'm always looking for an artist to push humanist ideas, to push questions about the culture and how we're being treated and how we're treating others.
But second question about how to...
Oh, you already did. You just give me a card and we'll talk later.
Okay, thank you.
Есть еще вопросы?
Человеку, только начинающему разбираться в перформансе, хотелось бы узнать, есть ли такое понятие, как плохой перформанс и хороший, и вообще какие критерии оценки перформансов существуют? И второй вопрос, наверное, думаете, какие перформансы, какие темы перформансов будут актуальны в будущем? Спасибо.
Everyone likes 2 questions. I like that. Okay, 2 questions. Remind me the first one. The first one was...
So the first one was, what is the difference between the good performance and
Oh,
the bad
good performance and
performance,
bad performance.
and if they exist, the
Right.
criteria?
What's your favorite food?
Национальную.
What was that?
The answer is really great, so it's like national food, but I just don't understand what's that.
Okay. My point being, you know, like anything in life, the more knowledge you have, the more, you know, you could put some different bottles of wine here, and somebody who's never tasted wine before is probably going to think it all tastes disgusting, actually. But actually, the more you start drinking different wine, you build an understanding of taste. So yes, there are good performances and there are awful performances and there's everything in between, but invariably that comes from a lot of knowledge. You know, why do we like certain kind of architecture? It's not universal. You know, we inform ourselves of a lot of different things. So there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of looking and a lot of keeping your eyes open and a lot of experiencing the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, before one makes those decisions. And you know what? I can say something is absolutely fabulous. Somebody sitting next to me can say it's the worst thing I've ever seen. And I had that the other day. There was something that I was like, even from Performa, I'm not going to tell you what it was. And I was like, oh. And I was sitting next to a critic from the New York Times, and she wrote to me that night. She said, that is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Can I have that person's address? I have to write to her tonight. And I was literally trying to go out of the room with a blanket over my head. So, and we're both pretty sophisticated. We both see an awful lot of work. New York Times, you know, I write also for the newspapers, and she loved it. I couldn't stand it. So explain that. I mean, you know, we're all coming at work with so many different references, with so much different poetry, with so many different criteria. You know, who knows what in her life made that work so exciting for her. She kept thanking me. I'm still getting emails from her thanking me for doing this piece. And I'm still trying to understand why she was so excited about it. So, was there another question?
And the second question was put as like, which themes will be popular in performance for the next time, or maybe any trends that you can foresee?
You know, I really think you know, what do they say in comedy? Timing is everything. I think performance is very much about now. I think there's going to be a lot of performance coming, and I think it has a lot to do with media. It has a lot to do with the fact that we all work in so many media all the time, and every one of you has a camera in your pocket that can take video, that can record, that can make music, that can, you know, you could be making a movie right there and show it, you know, at the Oscars next week or something. I think that because we're such a multimedia society, and by the way have been for the last 100 years, the 20th century was totally a multimedia century, but somehow they got us believing that it's painting and sculpture, and you know, that those were the two main things. So I think performance it lends itself to a lot of complex conversation, to be able to put a lot of complexity into a work. So I think we're going to be seeing more performance.
Был еще вопрос вот здесь.
Speech is ethics in action, performance и этика в действии. But it doesn't seem that what you're saying is actually challenging the ethics of themselves. It seems that the samples you picked are, you know, warm and cozy and sweet, but they're not about ethics.
Actually, that's not my title, so we should just correct that. That's the title of this very exciting weekend that's coming. That starts tomorrow, and there will
May I then ask a different question?
Yeah.
Don't you think that performance itself, or the way it is viewed, is only part of much more, much wider subject of action? You started with works by Futurists, and indeed it was more of a lifestyle covering much deeper processes. And then we have such practices as let's say, happenings. And so what you're talking about is performance, I guess it's performance, not as a wider
No, I think that, you know, I'm trying to race you through such a tiny sampling of different kinds of work. So as I said, today my motive, my one thing that I want you to leave with is that there's such a vast range. But I could start with any one of those artists and open up and look back and see what those artists are talking about. There's a much bigger story, a much more complex story, that each of them, whether it's singular or as a group or as a series of different artists, it's such a vast history. You know, right now, even in another book I'm working on right now is really looking at performance in Bangladesh and in India and in South Africa, and that's dealing with ritual, and that's dealing with a very different idea of citizenship that has nothing to do with the Western notion of art. They don't have art markets. They don't have art stores. They don't separate. There's sound and there's music and there's making visual storytelling. It's impossible to answer any of these questions tonight, because we could go into each one of them demands either a book or a long conversation. Some of the work seems more trivial. Some of it is very profoundly rooted in a political critique. And there's another part of me. I'm showing you work very poorly in this environment because it's got so much light on it. I'm showing work that's going to keep your attention, because I know if I don't, you're going to go to sleep. So I need to also show you work that is visually very strong. And so a lot of the work you're seeing, it seems to be always about work that has some kind of spectacle aspect to it, but that's the nature of trying to reconstruct, trying to show you material from the past. But I'm totally agreeing with all your questions, that this work seeps out into much larger questions about lifestyle, about who is the artist, why should we listen to them, what are they talking about, what's going on here. And that's what we try to ask all those questions when we create this biennial. I think that's it. We should... Pardon?
That's you. So I think 2 more questions. Есть еще вопросы? Сейчас где-то.
Вот хотелось бы узнать о вашем отношении к документации перформансов. Если говорить об аутентичных перформансах, то второй половины 20 века, например, или вообще в 20 веке, можно ли по фотографии, потому что видео все-таки немного другая история, можно ли по фотографии интерпретировать вот эти перформансы вообще, или, как вот есть интересный спор вообще сейчас об этом. И вот, может, второй вопрос тогда с помещением все-таки перформанса в контексте современного музея. Как вы считаете, что это для художника или это навязано как-то все-таки кураторами и так далее? То есть как-то законсервировать этот процесс, хотя это все-таки процесс прежде всего. И какая-то жизнь, связь с реальностью.
Great. Yeah, no, these are all great questions. Thank you, everybody. As far as your first question, sorry, what was it?
So the first question was about documentation. So what is your
documentation is very important. So are there a lot of art historians in the room? Is that what we're talking about here? Yes? Okay. Just think about how much work you've really seen. Maybe you're writing your dissertation on Titian or something, or on Piero della Francesca, and probably most of the work you've seen is not the real thing. Or maybe you see slides like this, they're 20 foot high, or maybe you see something that's the size of a stem. So I think documentation is an essential part of the way we acquire knowledge. I think, if somebody finds a little broken cup in Pompeii, it has a huge story attached to it. We learn a lot. So my feeling about documentation is that it's very exciting. It allows me to revisit something. And actually that ties also to your second question, because at any time, there were very few people who were at any of these things. It's like, you want to read about Klepnikov and the Viktor Shklovsky and the Russian Futurists, language poets in Russia, 20 people, 10 people, 15 people, but we study it. That's how we get inspired by different parts of life, that come from very limited documentation, very scrappy documentation. So I think it's part of the way we acquire knowledge is through all kinds of references, and documentation is an important part of that.
And so there was just one aspect in this question, for whom it is done now, so that the performances are getting places in the museums, whether it's for the curator or it's for the artists themselves. What is your opinion?
Whoa, we need a whole discussion here about the changing museum. What is a museum nowadays? because museums are changing very fast. I remember the old days when I used to go to Paris and I'd go to, Musée de l'Art Moderne was up on the hill. There'd be no one there except one really cute guy over there, that was it. You just looked at the avant-garde and, the old days of visiting a museum was like going to a library. It was really quiet and beautiful and was about studying. And nowadays everyone goes to a museum and they want action and they want to see a lot of people and they want events. And so, that have that answer. I still think artists work for themselves. It's tough enough to be an artist. I think the starting point is their own interests and their own drive, and you've got to have enormous courage to be an artist, to make that decision that you think you can make people believe in you and you're going to spend your life doing that. That's a big, big, big step right there. So I don't think any artist is doing it except because they have a deep, it sounds corny, but yes, they do have a need to make these things and a desire and maybe even talent that's pushing them. But we could go into a much longer conversation about the nature of curating and the curator as defining the times and the terms. The curator has suddenly got this role that didn't exist, 20 years, 25 years ago, 30 years ago. When the curator was a much more, I don't want to say modest, but in some ways they were more modest. I mean, even a great curator like Harold Zeman, there was a very quiet way of working where the work sort of talked for itself. We could go into an entire history about shifts in curating, shifts in museums, and certainly, performance is in there and will be more and more so because now all new museums are building performance spaces. They're now starting to create performance departments. They're now having performance curators. So we're looking at a period coming up where performance is going to be part of just about every museum because it's now being understood that it's a great way to get younger people into museums. British Museum is doing performances. I'm sure the Pushkin is doing performances. The Hermitage, I know these things are all coming. They're happening. And it can be also tied to a certain kind of marketing vision, but you know what, if it supports artists, that's great, because the artists still will come up with, there's still a level of ideas and imagination that I want to see supported. So if those larger institutions are now going directly to the artists and supporting the artists, I'm all for it. It's going to be complicated on the way, but we can't stop that tide. That these are the changes that are happening in the art world that have a lot to do with economics, with marketing, with the nature of the societies in which we live. And we're on, it's moving all the time and changing.
Thank you very, very much. I think we're going to wrap it up. Спасибо вам большое, дорогие друзья, за интересные вопросы. И мы ждем вас завтра, 13 декабря, и послезавтра, 14 декабря, в 10:30 утра. У нас есть целых 2 дня очень интересных лекций, докладов, теоретиков, философов, критиков и художников. А также все это завершится перформансами в Еврейском музее в субботу вечером. У вас есть программки на стульях. Спасибо вам большое. Давайте поблагодарим RoseLee Goldberg. Thank you very much.